Thanks to all of you for joining us again. And today I have the pleasure to introduce Federico Waitoller. He is an associate professor at the Department of Special Education at the University of Illinois at Chicago. And currently he's a Fulbright visiting professor in our university, in the Autónoma of Barcelona. His research focuses on urban inclusive education and has two strands. On the one hand, the impact of market-driven educational reforms on a student with disabilities. He will talk about this topic today. He has actually published very recently a book about the topic of today's session. And secondly, the teacher learning and pedagogies for inclusive education. His interdisciplinary work draws from political economy, critical geography, critical disability and race studies, and cultural historical theory. He has widely published in reference journals of education. And probably it's also very important to highlight that despite his academic work, or besides his academic work, Dr. Waitoller has collaborated very actively with and has presented research finding to various stakeholders in the Chicago area, including parent and neighborhood organizations, legal advocate groups for students with disabilities, the Chicago Teachers Union, and school districts administration. He also testified in public hearings before local and national politicians. His work has been referenced by parent, educators, and community advocacy groups, and appeared in major Chicago media outlets. So as you can see, he's an academic with a lot to say about the topic of school choice, with a special reference to special education to students with disabilities. So very important, a key issue in the topic of this winter school. And his approach to these stakeholders and to these practical experiences, I am sure, will give us a lot of insights on the topic. So Federico will talk for 45-50 minutes, more or less. We'll be flexible with that, but then to give some room also for debate, questions. As we did yesterday, please use first the chat to identify the question, to describe the question, and then I'll give you the floor and we'll try to sort all of them thematically if necessary, okay? So Federico, the floor is yours. Welcome.
Thank you. So I'm going to start sharing my screen. Let's see. Here we go. Share. And all right. So everybody's able to see the screen. Perfect.
Yes.
So first, thanks, Xavi, for such a generous presentation. It's so excited to be here. I think she has a great opportunity for you as part of students of this program, with this amazing lineup of speakers and activities. And also for me, I feel very humble and honored to be among such great scholars presenting, and honored by you taking the time. Another time in Zoom. I know you can't get enough of Zoom these days, so you're spending some time, and I thank you for that. So today I'm going to be presenting, as Xavi, Professor Bonal said, on my last book, titled Excluded by Choice, Urban Students with Disabilities in the Education Marketplace. And I placed there a quote from one of the reviews of the book, because I think encompass one of the major things that I wanted to do with this book, which was to really try to portray the nuances, the messiness, the complexities of how families experience school choice policies, particularly those families who live at the intersections of race and disability. So I wanted to move beyond just saying school choice is good or bad, or saying they produce good academic outcomes or not, but really delve a little more deeper to see what does it mean this for real people. So this is the outline of the book, and I'm mostly going to be presenting from chapter 2 and a little bit for chapter 3, and I give you a line afterwards of the rest of the chapter, so you know the flow of the story. And I want to put 3 caveats before I start. First, this is not going to be a traditional research presentation. I'm not going to start with my theoretical framework, my questions, my methods, and then show you my findings. I'm going to focus on parent stories, which I think are much more powerful than whatever methods I was using. If you're interested in methods, I did left a lot of slides at the end of the presentation, so you can ask questions in the Q&A, and I could pull back the presentation and show you and be transparent about how I conducted this research, which is not research to be seen plural, right? This is the work of 5-6 years of research in multiple ways, from quantitative to qualitative to geographical information systems, as you will see in a minute. So I'm going to be presenting these 2 chapters, and as you see these stories, these are my other the other 2 warnings. I want you to pay attention to 2 things, to 2 themes that runs through the chapters and through the books. The first one is that parents experience school choice amid these structural forms of oppression. You'll see that are inscribed in the geographies of the city, in this case, the city of Chicago. So I draw a lot, you'll see, from Black feminism, particularly the work of Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins, to look at the intersections of these structural forms of exclusion and oppression. So that's the first thing, the first theme that when I present these stories, I want you to think about. The second theme that I want you to think about when I present these stories is that I took a dialectical approach to space. You will see in the stories, and I want you to think about how place, meaning how people perceives and make sense of material space, is influenced by the ways that material space is produced. And it's in this dialectic between how we perceive space and how that space is materially produced that we need to situate how people make educational choices. So keep those themes in mind, and now we can start with the stories as the background. So again, stories from chapter 2 and chapter 3, choosing schools, stories of desperation, but also stories of optimistic attachments. And I'm going to start with the story of Chanel and Morgan. It was a sunny morning in the late September of 2015, one of the most beautiful months in Chicago. The hot, humid summer was in the past for Chicago residents, and the brutal cold winter was far off yet. Leaves were changing colors as I drove about 25 minutes on I-94 from the University of Illinois at Chicago and exited towards Lake Michigan and the small Black neighborhood where Chanel lived. Chanel was the parent of Morgan, a kindergarten boy with autism. Morgan, she explained, was diagnosed with autism when he was about 19 months, so he immediately went into early intervention program, where he received developmental and speech therapy through early intervention services. By the time Morgan was about to start kindergarten, Chanel had bought a house in the south of Chicago that had been highly impacted by foreclosures during the 2007 housing crisis. This economic context allowed Chanel to buy a home for only $29,000. She shopped around for a while and looked for almost 60 foreclosures until she found one that was strategically located. Across from her house, there was a park that occupied 2 city streets, a school that took up another street, a church, and a karate school. These landmarks make her street appear quiet and safe. And here I'm going to show you the first map of the city of Chicago. Do you see my pointer too? Or just the presentation?
Yes, we do.
Yes.
Great. So here, to give an idea, this is downtown Chicago. All this white space, it's Lake Michigan. It's a huge lake. If you haven't been there, it looks like the ocean. The first map, and this is the only map that I'm going to show you that were not made by me and my team. This is, then I'm going to show you some other maps. Chanel live right here in this area where the arrow points. The first map shows you the rates of foreclosures that happened after 2007 with the housing crisis. The other map shows the segregation and concentration of the Black community on the city of Chicago. The map contains other information that I want you to, for now, to put on hold. But I want you to see that Black communities, particularly Black low-income communities, were the highest impact by foreclosures in the house-to-sell market. And this allows Chanel to buy an affordable house, in a sense, in a street that, at least the street she perceives safe. Yet, despite that this street looks safe to her, the walk to her neighborhood school presented a different landscape. Safety in the neighborhood was a very important aspect for her to not end up sending her son with autism to the neighborhood school. And here's the quote from her when I asked her about her area. It's the hood. Even before I move over here, it's considered, pardon my language, the host role. Prostitution, prostitutes walk up and down. There is a motel right here on this corner. They take Jones. That is this neighborhood. There is a lot of drug activity. To me, it was in too close proximity to the neighborhood school, especially when you're talking about a special needs child who cannot talk. Or we can add also read some social cues. And just a translation, to take Jones means to take pimps, to take people who manage prostitution. So in spite of her block being perceived as safe, the broader area and her walk and the area where the neighborhood school was perceived by her as unsafe. But interestingly, the history of Chanel's area is not solely a history of crime and decay and prostitution. Located at the center of the south side of Chicago, her area looked very different at the beginning and the middle of the 1900s. In the early 20th century, her area was actually mostly populated by Irish, Italian, and Swedish. Black communities were only 1% of the population. In the 1960s, Black middle-class residents moved in large numbers because the area's high standards of property maintenance, a high engagement of residents in the community organizing, and also very good schools. The area became a stronghold for Chicago's Black middle-class culture and vibrant Black-owned business. This was a place where many Black residents wanted to come to live because it was a good place for Black families. So here comes the question, right? So why was Chanel's area experiencing foreclosure and crime? What contributed to her experiences with safety that shaped her school decisions? The answer to these questions is rooted in the history of state-sanctioned racial segregation in the city of Chicago. While Black residents moved in during the 1960s, white residents moved out due to the block-busting tactics of real estate agents who scared them and urged them to move because their property values were rumored to be decreasing because of the influx of Black residents. Contributing to these block-busting strategies, city laws, state-sanctioned laws, derail the development of mixed-race housing developments and prevent Black residents from obtaining equitable housing loans. By the late 1960s, the area was 64% Black. And by the time I met Chanel in 2015, the area was 97% Black and had experienced one of the most severe economic declines in the city. This decline reflected in a steep increase in unemployment and crime. Contributing to such negative changes in Chanel's area was a combination of declining work opportunities as the economy shifted from industry to service, and importantly, there was a severe economic disinvestment by the city of Chicago for 5 decades. The area where Chanel lived experienced what economist geographer David Harvey calls uneven geographical development. That is, waves of capital investment are unevenly distributed, created a new or reproducing former spaces of wealth while simultaneously increases spaces of poverty. Uneven geographical development is structural rather than random. The uneven distribution of resources is inscribed in the pre-existing racially segregated geographies of the city and builds upon pre-existing structures of racial and economic inequities. This uneven development creates areas of both under and overdevelopment, marked by racial lines and sustaining the privileges of wealthy white residents, and therefore it represents a structural form of racism. And in the city of Chicago, we have happened since that the late 1990s or 1990s. So we have a revamp of the downtown area. This is the River Walk in Chicago, where millions of dollars have been poured to improve the city, to attract companies, to attract capital investment, and to draw back white families that have left from 1960 to the 80s to the suburbs. Also, with the creation of Millennium Park, if you've ever been in Chicago, the downtown it's absolutely gorgeous. With the Chicago Art Institute, Millennium Park, the River Walk, and a beautiful skyline. At the same time that these areas were promoted, some areas where working class and poor families live were targeted for gentrification. And where poor families live, they created high luxury condos, apartments, in where new middle class were begin to inhabit, pushing out some of these working class families. But at the same time that there is all this investment in downtowns and gentrificated areas like the ones like Chanel lived, experienced 5 decades of completely uninvestment, and therefore were left out to decay on top of all this history of racial segregation. So here's a map of the economic investment in the city that you were seeing in those pictures. Again, remember, here is the downtown area. The dots that you see there is what is called the Tiff Projects. And I'm not going to explain Tiff because it's a tax finance tool that it will derail the presentation. But just think these are tax investments, meaning state money, tax money, impuestos, that is used to economically develop areas of the city. And this money, sometimes, the majority of times, goes to private hands as subsidize or tax breaks to entice the development of certain areas of the city. This can include the production of apartment complex, luxury complex, the expansion of the subway, or parks or green walks that will promote certain people to move to those areas. So property taxes can go up. And just to give you a context, the majority of spending in a city in the United States, even the majority of school funding for schools, for public schools in the United States, comes from city property taxes. So it's a very important tax tool to finance city projects. So what you see there is a couple of things. You see there are 3 maps with the density of Black, white, and Latinx population. And you see that the high concentrations of projects financed by tax were in the downtown area right here, and the adjacent downtown areas. There were areas primed for gentrification. Why? Because they're close to downtown areas. They have easy access with the train. And I explain more with my second story that focused more on gentrification. and very little investment on areas like Chanel. You see, Chanel has almost no investment from tax money, and this is the darker the black, the darker the black community. And we can tell a similar story about the Latinx community in the city of Chicago. And this gets represented in the changes, in economic changes in the city of Chicago. So what these maps represents is the economic changes from 1970 to 2010 that occur in the city of Chicago. Again, the red arrows indicates where Chanel lived. The first numbers, 1 to 4, are communities or neighborhoods that did not experience any change. The yellow and the yellows show middle and upper class areas. The blue shows areas of poverty or extreme poverty that have remained in extreme poverty for 50 years. The greens are areas that have changed, and mostly areas of gentrification when economic development has increased. And brown of our interest in the story of Chanel were areas of decline, areas that in the 1970s were economic, they were doing well, like middle class areas, and have severely or mildly declined now to low income and poor areas in the city of Chicago. And you see here the dark brown in the area of Chanel. So this history of racial segregation and uneven investment has a profound impact on how the city developed economically and geographically. But schools is part of this as well. Here again, the red arrow showing where Chanel lived. This shows the development of the school market, to say in some way, in the city of Chicago. The first map with the background now of this economic development. The first map shows you where charter schools are located. Charter schools are sort of similar to concertados in Spain. So there are, but yeah, I see Xavi shaking her head. There are several fundamental differences, and he's right, but just give you a comparison. Concertados has a much longer history and in nature they're much more religious. These are much newer schools that began in the 1990s that receive public funds and supposed to give free education to students, but they have complete autonomy. They're private entities. And there were a way to generate this school choice market where parents can choose different schools. The second map shows you where magnet schools and also selective enrollments. These are schools that are still public, they are run by the district, but they have a particular focus like arts, on science or STEM, and some of them are selective enrollment, means you need to test in, you need to take a test to be able to get in. And the last map, very interesting, the closed schools, because Chicago at the same time that been open these selective enrollment and charter schools, it's been also closing schools. Since the 2000s, Chicago have closed over, I think, around 120 schools. Large majority of them from 2001 to 2012 were due to underperformance. So schools that for 5 years have not performed well, they were closed. And in 2012, 13, and 14, particularly in 2013 and 14, Chicago closed 50 schools in 1 year, all elementary schools, due to under-enrollment, in a way to right-size the district spending. So you see here, very interesting, we see the map on the farther right, on the closed schools, that these closed schools are crammed in areas of severe extreme poverty, and some of them in areas of gentrification and here on the west side. While we see some overlap with these charter schools, so we're closing these charter schools in this area and this area overlap much with the patterns of closing schools. What we see is this development of a market where we close neighborhood schools and we open these new form schools where Peck and Antico call us rock back of Keynesian forms of school delivery and rollout of pseudo-private forms of social services, in this case, schools. So we start seeing the history of Chanel's area and how her choices are really need to be understood with this backdrop of economic development and racial segregation in the city and how that affects the development of the school. This is a very close map, but with the percentage of the concentration of Black communities, closed schools, highly impacted Black communities in Chicago, and the same thing with charter schools. So these are areas, the closing of schools and the opening of charter schools highly impacts the educational experiences of Black communities, and I would argue Black students with disabilities, as I show you in a minute. So again, if we go back to Chanel's quote, Chanel described her surrounding of her neighborhood as fraught with crime, but this crime is not a happenstance, but actually her perceptions of crime are shaped by the production of these spaces that over time, from racial segregation through economic disinvestment, have generated spaces in where she perceives as unsafe, and actually safety out of this were like 24 families that were part of this book was probably one of the most key factors for these families to make educational choices. And again, she sees this particular significance of this safety for children who with disability who may not communicate or may struggle to read social cues, both which can make students more vulnerable to violence and crime. But as I say, this is not just about structural racism, but also structural ableism and their interactions. Chanel was fighting against Morgan's, her child with autism kindergarten, placement in a segregated setting in the neighborhood school. As I say, Morgan was diagnosed with autism when he was 19 months. And she explained, he did a lot of screaming and things like that, but he had the ability to talk. So he could say words by the time he was 3. I taught him to read, he could spell his name, but he couldn't tell you his name. He could count until 30. He knew the shapes and all the colors. When she tried to place Morgan in another school that was not her neighbor school, still run by the district, the district told her to place Morgan in a segregated setting, in a segregated classroom for students with autism, what we call sometimes in the US a self-contained classroom. But here she said her perception when she started seeing where Morgan was attending. What it looked like to me, there is from the quote, from the academic standpoint, they were babysitting him. And I don't need him to be babysat. The special needs kids to me is that cool were not I knowledge at all. Neither Chanel nor Morgan's speech therapy thought actually that the self-contained classroom was the right place for Morgan. But still, the interdisciplinary team of the district told her that there was no other option for him. And the only place that we could set him was this segregated classroom. There was nowhere to put him, they told me. So we can't do anything, they say, Chanel expressed to me. And he also explained that my whole thing is that don't just tell me that he can because he has autism. Let his abilities speak for themselves and let him be with his typically development peers. These struggles between her and the district lasted a year until she grew increasingly dissatisfied and filed a state compliance with the state board, the state of Illinois Board of Education, which is the major institution that rules schools in the state of Illinois. Now, again, what Chanel was experienced with segregation was not unique to her. Chicago, the district, has been the focus of textbook court cases for discriminating against and segregating students with disabilities, particularly those who are Black. For instance, in Corey H. versus Chicago Boards of Education in 1992, Chicago public school districts were found responsible for segregating students with disability solely on the basis of their disability classification, rather than on their students' individual needs, violating core provisions of the federal law, what the federal law says is that you need to place students according to their individual strengths and needs, not just about a broad categorical identification like autism. And we see this in the statistics that shows the inclusion of students with disabilities in Chicago public schools compared to national standards. There, the table, what is showing is the percentage of students with disabilities by different disability categories that spend more than 80% of the day in the general education classroom, in the regular classroom. We see there, for example, like students with autism, like Chanel's son, only 25% of them spend more than 80% of the day in the general education classroom, when in the US in the 40%. We also see huge disparities, for example, on intellectual disabilities, almost 3 times lower than the national average, more than 3 times lower than the national average. We can also argue that the national average is very low, and I will argue that as well. But Chicago is also particularly problematic and at the time to include students with disability. And these are mostly Black and Latinx students with disabilities. So with a colleague, with our team, we did a statistical analysis looking at racial disparities in the inclusion of students with disabilities in Chicago public schools. We did a longitudinal study comparing odds ratios. And what we found is that across 4 years, if you see the first table, the first column, just to give you an idea, this says more than 80%. This is, they spend more than 80% in the general education classroom. These are students that spend between 40 and 70% in the general education classroom. And these are students who spend less than 40% in the regular classroom. And what we found that if you just look at all schools across 4 years, they're all statistical significance. That means that white children with disabilities are at least twice as likely to spend more time in the general education classroom than Black students with disabilities. In the second table, interestingly, we tried to compare charter schools with neighborhood schools. And we found that neighborhood schools have this relationship is much stronger. But when we see charter schools, we see at the beginning those, they're not statistically significant, but the times pass by, those relationships become statistically significant. So we were hypothesizing using organizational theory that as these charter schools became institutionalized and began to serve more students with disabilities, they began to mirror the same racial inequities that neighborhood schools experience. So Chanel, again, was experiencing this, making these school choices amid these intersecting forms of structural racism and ableism. On the one hand, the histories of their neighborhood of racial segregation and disinvestment that shape her perceptions of safety, and on the other hand, the structural ableism that continue to segregate students with disabilities in the US and all would argue beyond. So at the end, when we ask her how you're making your choices, she said this: you know, how people will make the comments, the devil you know versus the devil you don't. People that will tell you to go with the devil you know versus the devil that you don't know. For me, I'd rather go with the devil that I don't know, because there is a possibility that it's not a devil. I was pretty much done with Chicago public schools. I don't know if there is a translation for this saying in Spanish, el demonio que no sé, al demonio que sé, no sé. Lo dejo a ustedes. But what happened to Chanel, it says, I have so poor experiences in my neighborhood with my schools across time that I'd rather go to see something that I don't know with the possibility that is better. So she ended up enrolling her son in a charter school. And what happened to her son, the charter school? Well, I'll let you read chapter 4 when you buy the book. And I want to bring another story. I still have a half hour, so why not? We like stories. And this is the story of Kendall and Tyler. Kendall, for instance, was a Black parent living in an area of extreme poverty in the south side of Chicago that had one of the highest rates of gun violence in the city. Her son, Tyler, identified with ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also experienced other health conditions related to his digestive systems. Kendall perceived that her neighborhood had actually gotten worse over the years and reported the following. I live now here for 13 years. We have always had a lot of crime in the area with gangs, the drugs, and things of that nature. The fighting, it has gotten worse over the few years. It's like double or triple in the last few years. And these perceptions of safety, of course, are shaping her views of schools around her neighborhood. She continued. I grew up on the Richmond Way, the projects that were down the street. Once we move out, we move into a different environment, which wasn't as bad. However, since they closed the projects down, and since the people are scattered now, that's when we began to see a spike in more of the crimes. Since they have closed those down, it's like everybody is like everywhere. That you have certain people coming into certain territories, where the ones who are there are very territorial. Of course, that's the only way I can see those crimes actually going up so high. Yes, I mean, it makes sense to me because, like I said before, we had crime in these areas, we had killings, but not as much, maybe not as much. And what Kendall is talking about here by the projects and the Richmond Way, which is kind of a pseudonym, she's talking about the Robert Taylor homes. This stretch on the south side of Chicago, who were high-rise public housing. And this high-rise public housing has a history when what we call the Great Black Migration moved from the South to cities that were industrializing after the end of slavery in the United States. They were grouped and state-sanctioned, segregated in this particular area of Chicago. After time and the same state-sanctioned tactics of segregation that I mentioned before, from not providing equity housing loans to Black communities to also derail mixed race housing. These communities, these Black communities, were isolated, segregated, and contained in this particular area of Chicago. And there are many of these housing projects around the city. This is just one of them. But in the 1990s, with the idea to renew the city and revamp the city and roll back Keynesian forms of social provisions, Major Richard Daley and his administrator have a plan to rebound the adjacent areas, the closed areas to downtown. The central goal was to improve the quality of living, dining, cultural venues, housing, and schools to attract highly paid professionals and middle class back to the city of Chicago. As I show you in the prior map, and I think I'll show you back in a minute, these are the areas where this great investment, tax investment, took place. The most emblematic case of this quest was in the displacement of thousands of working class and poor families living in public housing through the tearing down of more than 19,000 housing units located in what was already segregated Black communities. These public units had been left to purposeful decay for several years due to lack of maintenance and investment from the public housing authority. Part of the replacement plan was to build mixed income communities. Yet this new displacement approach did not provide housing to all the families. And instead, these units were demolished without a one-to-one replacement. The Houston family directly affected by the demolition of public housing have to move from extremely distressed housing situations to neighborhoods that were still impoverished, hyper-segregated, and perceived as unsafe. like Kendall was illustrating in her quote when she said, we were living there, but we moved down south to a similar neighborhood. And much like Kendall, research shows that family moving to neighborhoods farther south and west in the city from these housing projects reported greater fear and violence than those staying in the housing projects. Of course, this again, want to bring back, shapes our perceptions of safety and our school choices that we make for these parents. And just to illustrate again, showing you back the map of investment in the city of Chicago, this is the area that we're talking about. Highly invested, close to downtown, with high, and in that moment, with a large increase of a large Black population. And if we put back the other map that I show you, we see that this area also has a concentration of charter schools, some magnet schools in the close area, and also concentration close by of closed schools. And here in the green here is where Kendall lived. That's where the projects are located, or they were located because they were dismantled. And this is where she moved. So she moved from an area that's been economically invested, and she's displaced to an area of extreme poverty that has remained in extreme poverty for 50 years, highly impacted by school closures and the development of charter schools. So here's the rollback. On one side, we're rolling back the Keynesian forms of social service provisions, in this case of housing. And this is how this area looks now. This is the rollout, how investment looks like on the material space. This is a new railway station, some condominiums. And the demographics of this area has changed dramatically. The area is at least 0.5% white now. And it has or Black middle class, and it has very access to downtown and the lake area. But as I say again, this is not about structural racism represented in these housing policies and school policies, but also structural ableism, and in this case, on austerity measures that have cut special education services, policies of disposability. Black and Latinx parents of students with disabilities experience these special education services shaped by austerity measures that have cut special education funding. Here we have a few quotes of families. Around the city, the same thing with the Chicago public schools not being stable. The first program they cut is the special education. And they started letting go many special ed teachers that support our kids. Another quote, no speech therapy, no occupational therapy, no physical therapy. They didn't offer any therapies at all. I do remember attending a different meeting where we discussed the things that they needed and the whole transition. And told them what my children receive, and when they told me that they would receive those things, but they never received them. And what parents and Kendall are talking about. Several events that happened at the time that the interviews were going on. Austerity measures and treating students with disabilities as disposable and as a way to right-size the budget of the district, because the district has a huge deficit, economic deficit. Have impacted this economic deficit, have impacted special education services. Though the enrollment of students with disabilities in the school district have increased, the district have engaged in a series of efforts to right-size special education. For instance, in July 2015, CPS, Chicago Public Schools, released a school budget reducing its funds by 200 million, from which 42.3 million were cut to special education services. Schools with higher percentage of students with disabilities than the district average, which is 12%, now 13%, were hit the hardest, experiencing a reduction of 656 positions, while the remaining schools only experienced a loss of 26 positions. According to CPS, Chicago Public Schools, This was implemented after an 18-month review of staffing and services for students with disabilities, though CPS never made the documents used for this evaluation publicly available. After much pushback from principals, parents, teachers, and disability advocacy groups, the school district restored 150 special education positions in November 2015. Once classes were well underway, this happened while classes were well underway. CPS explained at that point that the formula used in the prior budget was flawed. As part of these changes, the CPS Director of Special Education resigned for the budget errors, and principals have to adjust personnel in the middle of the year, which was quite inconvenient to provide services to students with disabilities. But that was not it. The following year, another major scandal broke out regarding special education services. Amid parents and teachers' complaints that it had become very difficult to identify students with disabilities and provide their services and rights that are entitled by federal law, the National Public Radio broke out a story and brought a report that demonstrated that CPS, without publicly showing, contacted some of the most important consulting firms to overhaul the special education system without public disclosure or public input. The consulting firm established a series of procedures to make special education eligibility and services more difficult to obtain for teachers and parents. The result was that there were 350 fewer special education positions, 76 fewer aides, a 29% reduction of psychological support, and a 13% cut on special education and occupational therapy, physical and occupational therapy. There was also a 56% of reduction for funding for summer classes for students with disabilities. And this happens already in a context in where schools that were mostly white spend between $600 and $3,000 more in special education services than those that are majority Black or Latinx. This scandal generated an investigation from the Illinois State Board of Education into the district, and actually the district was found guilty. The CEO, the chief officer of this district, have to renounce, and the state found that CPS had violated federal law and put a person monitoring special education services in the district. Afterwards, the district had to spend millions of dollars in compensation to parents for not provided adequate services. So again, we see in Kendall the story of structural racism represented in housing and school policies, and forms of structural ableism represented in this case on austerity measures that have cut special education services as a way to right-size the budget deficits of the district. So these are the contexts where parents are making choices, parents of students with disabilities. And chapter 3 moves into what I call optimistic attachments. Because in this context, charter schools bring new hopes and raise new hopes and optimism in parents. Because these are new schools built, brand new schools with new young teachers that are coming out to neighborhoods that have experienced, as I show you, either gentrification or racial segregation or disinvestment, or all of the above together. And this, as I showed you earlier, charter schools market themselves in very specific ways that I won't get much into depth right now. But you need to understand, again, bringing the map, that they're located in the same areas in where gentrification is happening, in the same areas where extreme poverty have remained for 50 years, or communities have declined economically. So they bring a story of hope, and they're marketed as They market themselves as high rigorous academics, high rigorous discipline, which brings a sense of safety for parents. And they're marketed with billboards around the city, in school buses, in bus stops, in commercials, bringing the idea that they take you to college, that they have 100% rates of access to college and scholarships. So it became very enticing for these parents who have experienced decades of poor schooling experiences. Again, showing where charter schools are located with great concentrations of Black communities, Black families. So the question is, what happened when these students reach these charter schools? And the book talks into that, and I'll let you read that on your own. So let's draw some conclusions, and I begin to wrap up now. We need to understand that families experience school choice intersecting forms of exclusion or intersecting forms of oppression. Structural forms of racism shaped by uneven geographical development, this rollback and rollout of capitalism, shaping experiences and perceptions of safety and stability. Also, which I didn't talk much in this presentation about, deficit discourses about these communities, and very purposefully, these deficit discourses are deployed to create opportunities for new development in those areas. And also structural forms of ableism, from slash special education funds and services, and the continued segregation of students with disabilities, and also deficit discourses about students with disabilities. So, continue this conclusion, I think we need to understand these choices as decisions shaped by the production of urban spaces, its history fraught with structural racism and ableism, the communities inhabited it, and the deep emotions that it evokes within people, because the book and the stories are full of emotions of hope, despair, fight, and hope and despair again. As to conclude, we need to understand parental school choice not as psychological phenomenon based on a rational individualistic decisions, much like school choice advocates want us to think about, that people can examine academic scores and demographic data and the offerings of schools and make a rational decision, individualistic rational decision about where to send their kids. But we need to understand it as a social, political, and spatial phenomenon. Parents and other stakeholders, include these policymakers and school administrators, engage with school choice and what Edward Socha calls being spatial beings. We are shaped, our actions, thinking, and emotions are shaped by the space in where we live, and we also shape by our actions the spaces, in this case, the school spaces that we inhabit. And as I say, the book continues. Chapter 4, so will tell you the story, what happens when students are there, which is called, in these new charter schools, called The Cruelty of Optimistic Attachments, and shows how these students are being pushed out at these schools once they're enrolled in different and very detrimental ways. In chapter 5, the book talks about how parents actually fight tooth and nail to stay in those schools despite those bad circumstances. This chapter is called Sustaining Hopes of Inclusion. And of course, everything has its consequences. And the book, the story, delves into these consequences. The most deteriorating then were students' mental and health and behavioral and their behaviors. And they're very sad stories, because they're very real material consequences to these students' mental health, some of them needing to finish in therapeutic units. And here are some conclusions. Some of that I was saying before. and also trying to understand how these new forms of inclusion created for market-driven reforms ended up being these fantasies. And the book concludes with very concrete recommendations for policy, practice, and research. So I'm going to stop here. I think I did it on time for discussions and questions, and we can chat a little bit. And I also leave you with a discount code for the book if you want to, and the website in Europe to get it. Hey, so I gotta promote it, right? Thank you very much for staying with me for almost 50 minutes, and I welcome all kind of questions or discussion.
Excellent. Absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for this great presentation, Federico. I don't know whether I think the publisher must be really proud of you in the way you advertise the the book. So I'm sure people will buy after the speech. Definitely. Can you stop sharing the screen so we can see more all the faces?
Yes, absolutely. No, stop video. No, stop share. There we go.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, because I think you gave us great insight on this intersectionality that really shapes choice sets under these circumstances. And it's interesting because we have kept in several classes in Global reflecting on school choice rationalities among different social groups. And this is a demonstration that some of the theories that assume that people with in special difficulties, either economic or linked to disability or other issues of cultural minorities or whatever, they have strong choice rationalities, but shaped for very important contextual aspects, as the one really are showing in your research, which I find it really fascinating. So let's now open the floor for comments and questions. I see that at this moment there are two questions. One from, if there are other questions, please feel free to just add a comment to say I want to make a question in the chat, and we are plenty of time for that. Megan, you go first with this question on distribution of CAN students, and then Dasha. Okay, Megan, whenever you like.
Cool, thank you. Sorry, I'm not very familiar with the setting in the US and in Chicago. I've looked a little bit at school choice in the UK, and so I found it really interesting what you were saying, because it seems like all of the kind of structural discrimination seems to be much more exacerbated in the US. And so I just wanted to get a bit more familiar with it. And so I asked, are there any completely segregated, as in separate school settings for students with SEN? And kind of also, do charter and public schools have limits on the number of students with SEN they enroll? I'm kind of interested in terms of like segregation of these students. You talked a little bit about them being segregated within schools, but is there also the potential for them to be completely segregated in separate schools or institutions? And how do charter schools play into that? So, for example, have charter schools recognize that there's this market of parents and students who they could target and, you know, actually provide a lot of resources, a lot of additional services that might benefit them? Because I think in some of the articles you wrote about, they talked about how schools targeted these families, but when they got there, these resources were not really around. So yeah, I'm just trying to untangle all of this in my head. Sorry if that's not very clear.
Okay, let's keep the question short, okay? Just to have room for, no, it's okay, man, it's good. Let's collect like 3 all the time, because I see that people is jumping now with their questions. So I'll give the floor now to Dasha and Diego.
Should I answer or not sure I should answer?
Let's wait for 2 more questions, okay, Federico?
I'll start making note, because I'm not going to forget what they ask.
Well, if you prefer now to answer Megan, and then we will proceed like this, collecting 2 or 3 at a time.
Yeah, let me answer Megan, because she asked 2 questions, and I wanna answer. So first, quick about what's the situation of inclusion in the U.S. The U.S. But in general, there are very few segregated schools for students with disabilities. In general, I'm talking in general. In Chicago, they've been closing those off over time. There may be 2-3 schools in the entire district. On that, the most.
Sorry, Federico, is there a clear legislation on that in the US about inclusive education?
Clear? No. But there is a legislation. So what the law says is that school districts needs to provide a range of schooling options, and that interdisciplinary teams, including the parent and when appropriate, the student, make a decision what's best for that individual child. So that range of educational environments, it goes from super segregated, like segregated schools, even hospitalization, to full inclusion within regular schools, right? So when the student is identified to receive special education services, part of the individual educational plan that he or she receives, it describes where is the student going to receive those services. In the general education classroom, how many minutes? The most common way of service delivery in the US is a separate classroom. I think in Spain it's called aulas abiertas. It's a separate classroom within the school, and the student joins the regular education classroom for certain moments of the day, like let's say science or social studies, or maybe math. But then maybe in reading goes back to a specialized classroom and receives specialized instruction on reading if the student is struggling with reading. To me, that's still segregation, but that's a much longer discussion. But the law allows that, and it's very controversial. The provision of the law that allows that is called the LRE, the least restrictive environment. And it goes back to 1975, the Educational for All Handicap Act was the first federal policy that provided rights to students with disabilities to attend public schools. So that's one side of the question, Megan. The other one about charter schools, there are few charter schools that focus on specific disabilities. So now we do have in the US charter schools for students with autism, for example, that have found, let's say, a market niche on that. And some parents, particularly in the autism community, likes that. And they enroll students. The other ones operate much like the other neighborhood schools. The truth is, increasingly, I think some charter schools are building capacity to include students with disabilities. It heavily depends on the state you're in and on the school district that you're in, and how the school choice or charter school policy has been developed in that particular district or state. And there are different rates of inclusion and different rates of attendance in charter schools that vary widely across the US.
Thank you. We'll collect now 3, Dasha, Diego, and Andres, and then 3 more. Okay. Keep it short, guys.
Okay, so first of all, just thank you very much for your presentation. And also I find it very impressive how you build your research on the lived experiences of parents. But also because of this, I was wondering whether you had the opportunity to interview or through the other way reach also the other members of that individualized education program team, such as teachers or representatives of the school districts, and if you did it, if you have confronted them with your research, and then what are their perspectives?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Desa. So
wait.
Oh, sorry. I keep going. Go ahead.
No, otherwise it will take much longer. So you take notes, okay, Federico?
Yeah.
Your turn.
Okay, thank you, Federico, for your talk. I think my question is very much related to Dasha's, actually, is how pretty much my doubt is, as a researcher, you're seeing all this injustice happening and you're actually taking all the data. How do you navigate engaging with all those different stakeholders, be it teachers, be it parents, students, etc., who I'm guessing at times they can look at you as a reference and they can be asking like, hey, Federico, so what can I do? Because some people are desperate, actually, I'm guessing. So what can I do? What do you recommend I do? Where do I send my child? Or should I move? Or etc., etc. So how do you navigate this professional / personal ethical dilemma of doing what you do? I'm guessing.
Okay, as you can see, we debate quite a lot in methods course about positionality of the researcher. And now I take Andres, and I will give you the floor, Federico. Andres.
Yes, I was saying that I wanted to give my turn, but okay, this is it's because you already mentioned this. It's maybe what could be the relation between the pedagogical approaches toward disability in the definition of these educational markets that you just explaining. If you have like kind of explored this regarding, for example, this tension between special education and the inclusion education, mostly based in the universal learning design, that do not push forward to particularly teachers or schools. That's it.
Thank you.
So the first questions were from Dasa, right?
Yeah.
So in this, the book itself, no, doesn't. It has the sources of information beyond research reports, geographic information systems, quantitative data. The participants were parents and lawyers. So I work with the advocacy agency, which I didn't very much from the lawyers' interviews because they come later on the book. So I work with lawyers there, and I help a non-profit legal agency that provides services for parents of students with disabilities to understand the issue. We met several times. They helped me to recruit participants, and also I presented the findings to them and provide recommendations. And we continue our collaboration. Now a little less than I'm here. But I have encountered the district officials over time. I have presented my findings over time. At the beginning, and this kind of like permeates a little bit in what Diego was asking. At the beginning, I was very naive. So I moved in Chicago in 2011, and I started working on this issue. And for example, when school closings were about to happen in 2013, again, they were talking about, first they were talking about closing almost 300 schools, but of course that was just part of the negotiating process. But they ended up closing 50 schools. And they thought, but they did, that they could move these students in 3-4 months to new schools. So they were planning to, of course, closing in June and reopen, send all the students to new schools in Agos. So I met with district officials, with the school board. I meet with people in the high rank to talk about the implications of moving. These were about 3,000 students with disabilities and their services from one school to the other one, to schools that maybe may not have the expertise to serve the students, may not have the structures, may not have the resources, may not have the physical space to do it. So I met regularly. I met 2 or 3 times. We met to talk about this issue, and my recommendation is, if you really got to do this, I didn't want to do it, but at that point, I mean, they're going to do it. It doesn't matter what you say, and this is what you learn. There are decisions that are already taken, and they do take community and researchers' input, but they listen to you, and that's about it. Because there are decisions that are already making for reasons beyond research, because there are political reasons, there are budget reasons, that if your research can help them to move in the direction that they want to go, great. If not, they listen and they discard you. Okay. So I met many times. I warned them about many of the dangers. They move anyway with a brutal speed, and I'll say I don't want to pat my back, because I'm fortunate that I was right, but 60-70% of the things that I told them I was right. parents were going to schools that didn't have the services, have to move to another schools. IPs need to be shifted. Schools moved with kids with wheelchairs moved to schools that didn't have elevators. Many mistakes were made, and many students with disabilities education was compromised because of that. So I learned at the early stage that working with school and with highly officials was not very productive, and I still do. Actually, I met 2 weeks ago to talk about how school choice is structured for high school students with disabilities, because I'm working in a task force with a group of parent advocates. So I found myself with much more reception and impact in advocacy groups, in the Chicago Teachers Union, in places that maybe my research, if I go straight to administration, doesn't have much leverage, but in hands of these advocacy and activist groups, they have much more power, right? Because they have a much more political leverage than I do. So I tend to work with them. I tend to work with, when it's appropriate, with unions and with advocacy and activist groups. And Diego brings a good place. I mean, this is a fine line between researcher and advocacy, right? I call myself an engaged scholar because I am working in communities, at least when I was in Chicago, particularly with families of students with disabilities. So yeah, it's a fine line, but I think if in your research you're transparent, you show your methods, you show who you are, you put forward that positionality of who you are and the work you do, then you let other people to evaluate you and make their own decisions. But it's very important to be transparent on that. And I think in general, I mean, I do my research like any researcher, but then, I do work with these community organizations to push that agenda forward. So I think I answered Diego and Daza there, and if I don't, please follow up. And then the third question was about pedagogical approaches in different market niches, and it was mentioned there with UDL. I mean, UDL, yes, I teach UDL in my courses in teacher prep programs. There is a superficial understanding of UDL everywhere, not just in the US. I hear in Spain it's called DUA, Diseño Universal de Aprendizaje. And a lot of schools trying to implement it to a certain extent. But the special education in the US is heavily dominated by behavioral and cognitive paradigms, and they mostly focus on how to remediate academic deficits on one-on-one children, one-to-one basis. So very intensive interventions that are applied on individuals or small group basis. So that's the status quo, the big paradigm in the US, and it's very difficult to break not just the researcher's mentality, but also teacher's mentality, that may not be the most fructuous approach to teach students with disabilities.
Okay, there's 4 more questions. We will collect them, and then we will pass to the comments of the group of students for today. So now, Lainey first.
Hi, sorry, it's very early here. If you can't tell by my accent, I am a native Chicagoan. So I can confirm that everything is accurate and also 10 times worse, because I know that you just had to briefly go over everything.
This is called social validity, by the way, right?
Yeah.
Someone from Chicago is saying this is right. Go ahead.
Yeah. That's the Chicago way. We're loud and we yell at you. No, but what I was, my question really is just what does resistance sort of look like to this movement? I know one of the podcasts you sent us was about the teacher strike. And I think the case of Chicago is slightly unique in that it is a city that does have the Chicago Teachers Union is feisty and they're strong. And I mean, we've even seen with COVID, everything. And so there is that, but I was just wondering, what does resistance look like to this charter school movement, because the administration is different. However, it is still highly engulfed in neoliberal ideologies, and it's, yeah, that is my question.
Yeah, that's a great question, Lainey. Because I think every time that we need to describe and research and examine these inequities that we're bringing, the other hand is there's people resistant to this, and we also need to bring that to our attention. This is not issues that are just happening. There are people actively resisting, particularly in a city like Chicago, which is highly there's a high involvement of activism and power struggles. So there's a couple of things you saw in the case of charter schools. You saw the podcast. Teachers are getting organized and fighting for special education service and also better labor conditions in charter schools. The Chicago Teachers Union used to be very against charters at the beginning. And now what happened? Because in Chicago, charter schools was supposed to be a neoliberal idea to, in many things, among many things, was to weaken unions. Well, guess what? In Chicago, they start becoming unionized. Defined many of what some charter schools proponents were thinking. So now the Chicago Teachers Union stopped being so against charters because part of their constituency as unionized teachers are in charter schools, right? So they can't just go against charter schools, but they used to be very upfront to stop the approval of charter schools. Then you have community organizations that when charter schools may be able to open, may be against them. Now, that to say, there is also the advocacy for charter schools, right? Still, maybe even for like Black low-income communities, there are some parents that are very pro-charter schools. And again, this is because the context that as I showed you in this presentation, right? The district have failed them over and over and over and over again. So they found in these charter schools a way of optimism, and they're pro-charter schools. So you have both things. And then you have parent advocacy groups that have been contesting these charter schools ideas, different progressive movements. Even the Black Lives Matter at some point have put something on charter schools and school choice. And then brought on school choice. I'm working with a group of parents of students with disabilities right now. We wrote a report a year ago about what it means, educational options for students with disabilities going in high school, which is ridiculous because a lot of these programs to get in, you got to test in, the students cannot test in. So there's all this dubious way to get. Basically, there is no many options. That the school choice it's inexistent for some students. So there are different movements that are pushing back, and the district have slowed down the approval of charter schools and the closing of schools. So there is a slowdown of that. Oh, and by the way, one interesting story that probably Lani, you knew about this. In what was it, 2014, 15? I don't remember. One school that was being closed called Diet School. In south side of Chicago, Diet Academy, was a historical Black school and was being closed. It was being closed because it was purposefully fade out over time and withdraw from students. And parents did a hunger strike that lasted, I don't know how many weeks, to the point of compromising their health. And it got to a point in where parents were in such poor conditions, and it was such a scandal in the city because of this, that the district decided to reopen the school.
Fascinating. I will take two more, Riza and Daniela, and then we will change to the new activity. Okay, Riza, please.
Okay. Hi. I was just wondering if through your research, if you've noticed a relationship between race, special education needs, and the school to prison pipeline in Chicago or the US in general.
Daniela?
Yes, hi. So my question is a methodological one. I was wondering And I would like to know a little bit about your process of choosing the cases that you chose, especially because I guess you didn't base your conclusions and your knowledge of the case just on the interviews that you made. So how did you manage to choose and to kind of to argue the representativeness of the cases, and then to mix that in a coherent way with the experiences that you have gathered with your previous field work? So that.
Great question. So let's go with the first one. I personally have not done research on the school to prison pipeline, but I know that exists because other people have done research. And there is a link between racial disproportionality, that means Black and Latinx and Indigenous students being overrepresented in special education services, particularly those with behavioral disorders, and a direct pipeline across time to the juvenile system. So that's it. There's a great book I write on the chat. One of my good friends and colleagues, Subinia Nama, wrote, her thing is called The Pathology of the Oppressed. She was playing with, the title of Paulo Freire's book, but she interviewed, I don't know how many female youth in the juvenile system that had been in special education. The pathology, well, I'm misspelling this. Hold on. And it's a great book. So I put it there. I don't know if I spell it right. I did it pretty close, actually, I didn't, but so her last name is Anama. There we go. So it's worth reading if you are interested in school to prison pipeline. And the methods. So yes, that's a great question, Daniela. Were you thinking in general in the broader sample, or within my sample, the cases that I choose to tell the story?
I think the cases, the 20-something cases that you chose, because then you also said that you had a broader sample, and then you chose, you just interview like a small sample, and then the results are based on that. So
yeah, let me tell you a little bit about the sampling. So I work with different organizations to recruit parents. My sample, my general sample, were 24 parents. That was the parents that I interviewed. And it was actually it was geographically, very nicely geographically distributed. Very the racial and class composition was fairly representative of Chicago, actually, because I didn't just interview parents, Black parents living in low-income areas. I also interviewed middle-class parents, which stories were a little different too, but also similar. So out of the 24 parents, right, when you write a story, you analyze the data, and I use grounded theory. So I start from the smaller unit, like the sentence, right, and I start building my findings and theories from there. And then when you have the story built up, you say, okay, this is representative of parents with different shades, with different examples, with different maybe with some difference between parents, but there's some core aspects that we can work with here. And then after that, you choose to tell the story, the most compelling stories, and you do that according to what you think the story of the parents is, your knowledge, the research that you have done, and then you need to tell a story in a book, right? I tried to write this book and my articles as a form of storytelling, in a sense, because I think that's the most powerful way to transmit what I learned from these cases. Mm-hmm. So again, 24 were the general sample, plus the lawyers that were another 6 lawyers interviewed, and then choosing the most compelling stories.
Excellent. Okay, we will stop here the debate. I mean, we will continue, of course, because now it's time for there's a group of students that have specially focused on the readings you suggested and the podcasts. And now what we will do is, I think it's 5 of you. Let's use no more than 2-3 minutes each to put to bring your input, and then we open the floor again. And Federico, you feel free to comment on their reflection. Okay. On the basis of that, I have Dasha first. You want to start?
Yeah, I can start.
Okay, thanks.
So once again, thank you very much for this presentation and also responding to our questions. And for me, I have to say the readings were a little bit hard to understand from the point that I am from Slovakia, which is a completely different context. And I was tending to think a lot about the segregation here. And I was, for instance, putting that geography analogy also I was looking at it through my lens and through what happens here. So for instance, as you were explaining that space and place analogy, and also how the students are often segregated based on this and based on the safety problems, and which is very typical for the urban areas. I was thinking a lot about how this happens in Slovakia in rural areas, and how this is affected by geography as well. And so this was for me very interesting, this point of view. And just I feel like also your book, although it was not our reading, but I looked into your book as well, because there is a part of this available. And I found it really great how you use the storytelling to explain the difficult question and also to picture the market-driven education in the US. So this helped me to understand this way more than as if I just read an academic article. So I guess that's all from my side.
Thank you, Dasha. Megan?
Hi again. Yeah, no, I think kind of going back to what I said earlier, what I have been struggling with, especially since your presentation, is that I think that the whole market is a lot more complicated than what I'm used to and what I'm familiar with. And all of the different layers of discrimination and structural barriers, it just makes it really difficult to fully kind of disentangle all of the different factors that are influencing the placement of students. And so that kind of made me think about your the theoretical framework that you used in one of your articles about the 3 spaces. And I thought this was really interesting, actually. And I wrote an essay back last year about school choice in the UK. And I thought, actually, I would have really liked to have used that as my framework now. But I thought that in the context of what you're talking about in Chicago, and, you know, I think at the end you suggested using longitudinal mixed methods research. It just seems very broad and very, very ambitious to kind of look at all of this. And I know that's what you've done, but I'm just very surprised or impressed that that's even possible, especially when you're talking about coming up against quite antagonistic officials on a local level. So kind of like, how realistic is it that you could take such an approach when it is so broad and there are so many factors, and actually, you know, fully comprehensively cover all of that? I just can't get my head around that, I suppose. I think that's my biggest focus. It just seems very difficult to actually, at the end of it, be able to say that empirically these are all of the different factors going into it, when there's all these barriers you're facing, plus the amount of contributing factors involved with it, I suppose.
Thank you, Megan. You can realize, Federico, that all students are doing their thesis. And they're really
Yeah, I'm
concerned.
completely disillusioned from research at the moment. Nothing's possible, nothing's realistic.
No. It's absolutely great to talk about these issues and the difficulties of doing also the methodological aspect, not just the content. Absolutely, yeah.
Well, a good thesis is a thesis that is done. So
Yeah, exactly.
you don't need to go so complex.
That's also a good message for them, by the way. Riza, your turn.
Yeah. Super interesting, all the articles and especially the podcasts. Maybe kind of in opposite to Dasha, I went to university in the United States and studied education. So like the intersectionality of race and disability and education services was familiar to me, I think. What was kind of surprising is kind of the lack of research that with students and what students with special educational needs, what they think about it. But maybe in general, kind of that goes back to the fact that a lot of parents and also students aren't even aware of what their rights are and what they're entitled to and the services and support that they can actually get, which seems like a huge issue. And then also the whole conversation around charter schools, it's such a huge debate, but then there's also just such negative data about charter schools. And it's fascinating that people still support them, but that's neoliberalism for you. So yeah, those were kind of my major takeaways. Really interesting articles.
Thank you, Rita. Daniela.
Yeah, so same. I think it was very, very interesting. I really like how you kind of put in local words something that it's been mandated from, from macro instances. So I think that's amazing because there is always a lot of contrasts. And I think my major takeaway from this was to think, on purpose of one of the articles you sent about this contradiction between what is offered and then how in the name of inclusion you exclude, right? So it's kind of, it made me think how that's everything, like all of that happened in a legal frame and in a proved frame. So I was thinking that it would be also very interesting to think how these structural ways of exclusion are linked and are argued in the discourse, in political discourse, and like what are the arguments that they use to argue, to legitimate what they are doing. And with that in mind, it's like also there are a lot of institutional interests and intentions that are hidden. So that I thought that was super interesting because it's not just about talking about the institutional logics, but also about the interests and yeah, like more quotidian insights of these issues. So I think that's very, very interesting.
Thank you, Daniela. And the last one, Catherine.
Hi. As you were speaking today, I couldn't help but keep thinking about and wondering about the idea of standardized testing and how that might play into what we see, especially in the public school system, because I know that there's a lot of pressure on public schools in the US to meet different requirements, but that's among many different groups of students. So I know that is for students with disabilities, students with special education needs, students of different minority groups. I know there's a lot of pressure on schools, and also at the same time, a lot of the austerity measures that you mentioned, or closing schools that are underperforming. I could imagine that would have also an influence on the students that you've mentioned, because they have a lot of studies on how the measures that come with standardized testing, the austerity measures, really hurt the most disadvantaged students the most, and cut funding and programs and whatnot. And then that also was making me think of I think it was Falabella was the speaker that came to speak to us back in Barcelona, but she talked about the performing school mentality, where when you have the marketization of schools, like with charter schools, plus standardized testing, then these schools are just trying to outperform each other and try to get the attention of the parents, and how it could seem like the schools are getting better and meeting these students' needs, but it's really just sort of like this image that they're trying to present to attract parents and attract students, and how that can give the illusion that parents have a lot of choice in the matter, but that parents have a lot of power to change the schools. But in reality, I think it's only certain parents who have much more power than others. Anyways, those are just some of my thoughts.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you all. You want first to react to some of these comments, Federico, before we open the floor?
Sure. I start with Megan about the realistic of these methods, right? Well, this doesn't happen in 1 or 2 years. That's my first response, right? This is the work of 5 years of multiple studies put together to draw. So the book is a conclusion of many years of different kinds of studies. But you can go at smaller scale. Like, I give you an example. We are writing up a study now with my colleague and also Xavi and Tony's colleague, Christopher Lubienski. And we're writing up a study that we have, and we have a small grant. We have like, I think it was $50,000. We didn't have more of that. But what we did is we used kind of what he's been building and I've been building through the book. And we went to interview 12 parents of students with disability, 6 transitioning from kindergarten to from preschool to kindergarten, and 6 from elementary to high school, right? And what we did 2 interviews with them. The first one, we were trying to understand how they choose schools as they transition into these major landmark movements. And we got like a pretty good portrait of their choice sets and the reasoning that they were having. What we did after, because my expertise is on ethnographic qualitative interview and Chris is on quantitative and geographic information systems. So we got that information from this first round interview, we analyzed it, and he and his team created maps where show the location of this participant, all the schools around it with different kinds of information from demographic, test scores, school climate, so forth. So in the second interview, I went there with the maps and used the map as stimulus to continue the conversation about school choice. So that's one way. And then the background, the backdrop of that, right? It's, I personally like to look at the history of those spaces because I'm interested in how these choice sets are also shaped by the history of urban development. So that's a smaller case study. That's something a couple of years maybe you're able to do. It doesn't mean you need to do that for your thesis, but it's that more feasible. Bottom line is, go a little piece at a time, right? You can't do a whole thing at once, right? So build from less to more. Risa made some comments about the lack of parents, the lack of knowledge by some parents about their rights, which is totally absolutely right. There's a lot of parents, particularly low income, particularly parents whose first language is not English, who does not, in the US at least, who does not know all the rights they have under the federal law. That's one aspect of it. The other aspect is with these new school choice policies, the federal law is being pushed a little bit because there's a great ground, a fuzzy ground, because the federal law says districts cannot exclude students with disabilities. But that doesn't mean that the parent has a right to any school that the parent wants. The parent should have the right to the parent should be placed to the maximum extent possible to the closest school, to the neighborhood school with typically developing peers. But the district could also change, and that happens. Kids with disabilities go to other schools sometimes. But school choice brings another layer of choice, right? Because when students with disabilities goes there to a charter school, and the charter school doesn't serve them well, they're not kicking them out most of the time. They're telling them, oh, you can stay, but you know, we don't have the services. Oh, you know what? He may get expelled because of his behavior, her behavior, but you can stay. We're not kicking you out. It's your choice to make the best choice for your children. So here, the irony of inclusion, right? It's based on a child in a choice and a market-sized form of inclusion, where you are included to have choice, but those choices may not be the best for you, so you're excluded. And actually, in the last chapter, I theorized a little bit about that, but it's an interesting rationale because there's a funny. Supposedly, charter schools should not be able to discriminate or not accept students with disabilities. They should include them like any other schools because they receive federal funding. Now they can engage in this kind of choice rationale where they can offer some services and not others, and suggest the parent to find a better fit at school, right? And still, this is a little fuzzy in legal ways. Danila asked also about arguments to legitimize these school choices, and I think Risa says, why we still have them? Why we still have charter schools? I mean, there are many arguments to legitimize. I mean, we're debating about this. A lot of the people who are pro-school choice for charter schools are saying, in a sense, what at some stage the parents that I interviewed are telling me. We didn't have a choice before. Now at least we have a choice to send our kids somewhere. Some people say that they produce better academic outcomes. That's debatable, and the literature as a whole, not as a one study, but as a whole, is very dubious about that. Yes, no, depends on the charter school, depends how you compare it, depends the method you use. So it's not a yes, it's like maybe, but not for sure. I think there's a large movement financed sometimes by private foundations. Melinda Bill Gates Foundation for years supported charter schools. They still do to some less extent, but they did. The Joyce Foundation, the Walmart Foundation, they always heavily supported charter schools through different grants and stuff. So there is also a philanthropy apparatum behind this funneling money to this, which I think it's slowly subsiding, but we'll see what happened over time. What happened after the pandemic, and all the problems that public schools have with the pandemic as well. So there are many arguments to legitimate. I like Catherine's argument about the coming together of standardized testing and pressures and austerity measures, right? And how all those things are not just separated, but actually are they're all together working in people's lives and in schools' lives. The kids on the book have definitely a lot of pressures. When I told you there was a chapter on the consequences, there are kids that actually have pulled their hairs out of anxiety and beaten their entire nails off out of their anxiety. Some kids who went so into depression that had to go to a therapeutic counselor due to the high pressure of academic and discipline with very lack of academic supports for them. And it produced kind of these interesting phenomena from charter schools, because I think a lot of them, they're trapped on their own market identity. Because on the one hand, they want to, let's say, include everybody. Let's have a good face, and they say they do. But at the same time, they cannot change because their market identity depends on the practices that help them to marketize themselves as excellence on academics and punitive measures of safety. If they change that, they change their market identity. They don't have a niche on the market. So they're trapped in this paradox with students with disabilities, in where like maybe they want to include them, but their core practices that informs who they are in education and marketed are designed to exclude them.
Thank you so much for these inputs. Also, can I ask one question also, because I'm really much concerned about some policy aspects here. Whether, of course, we are in a context of free choice, in Chicago public schools and the system. But for instance, what we have in Spain, in many regions, is the possibility of quotes policy. So students with special needs, either physical or psychological, or also all kinds of disabilities, but also because of low socioeconomic background, have some reserved seats at a school. So they have kind of a priority of choice, which now with new regulations, this will be even stronger. Is this something that has been advocated for in Chicago, or is this something that families would see, families with disabled children would see as a positive policy, would you say?
It could be. The problem with these quotas is, and I think they have been proposed for some people, but I think these quotas have a problem that just they play a game. Like districts know how to play the game. So if they need to fill out quotas of students with disabilities, they may fill them. That doesn't guarantee that's going to be meaningful access first. That doesn't guarantee that after a month or two that kid is going to be leaving because the services are not provided. And that may guarantee that they just include the students, which usually tend to happen with they demand the less amount of extensive support, like students with mild learning disabilities or student who has an attention deficit disorder. And those students who would demand more extensive support needs to be able to participate in those environments, maybe continue to be excluded. But no, in the US, there's no policy for quotas for students with disabilities. I'll have to check in Boston or Massachusetts, they have something because they know they have some different legislation. But in general, no. And there's wide range, even within neighborhood schools, there is wide range of percentage of students with disabilities.
But wouldn't you say, at least in this context, this has happened. Some of the politicians actually defend the absence of quotes policy because they say, well, it's better that they go to those schools that they know how to treat them. Okay, so what ends up reinforcing segregation?
Yeah.
And self-segregation in choice itself, because it's normal that these families end up choosing those schools that receive their children in the better way, isn't it? So we have a risk of specialization here of some schools.
I think the theme of quota either needs to happen after or in tandem with a huge effort of building school capacity to serve all students. Because in some cases, I don't know if I want a student with disability coming to certain schools, because in some cases it's going to be, well, like in many of the stories on the book, it's not going to be a good place for them. So
the known or unknown devil, isn't it, as you said?
What?
The known or unknown devil.
Yeah, exactly, right? The unknown devil. So I think we need to start building, if we want to go there, we need to start spending significantly funds and effort and political effort in building capacity in each school to serve all students. Because there's schools and teachers, I would say, unfortunately, that I don't know if I want a student there.
Yeah, very right. Yeah. Okay, we still have some minutes. If there's one last question or last comment that you will, otherwise we can actually leave Federico, because it's been quite intensive for him talking for a long time and answering so many questions. So if there's no more questions, let me thank you again, Federico, for a wonderful session and a speech. It's been fantastic and fascinating. We have so much food for thought here for the coming days to keep reflecting on inclusion and education. And you and I will keep our conversation about future projects together for sure. Okay.
Perfect. Thank you, everybody, for staying. And I'm here. I don't know where you are. You're probably all over the world, but I'm here in the College of Education at Universidad Autónoma. So shoot me an email if you want to grab coffee or anything. I'm around until May, through May.
Thank you again, Federico.
Yeah.
And for the